Welcome back to the Dreamland Motel. Before we begin tonight's story, I need to share a short disclaimer. Some of what you're about to hear may be distressing. I don't highlight these details to cause harm. I share them because knowledge is power. The first step toward healing any wound is understanding its cause. For some, that cause lies in childhood trauma. For others, it's addiction, grief, or the quiet ache of a life that never quite unfolded the way it should have. But in the case of tonight's subject, the cause was something larger. A comprehensive government program that stepped beyond utility and into the realms of pure evil. And with pure evil comes disturbing details. So if you're not in the right headspace for that kind of bedtime story, perhaps tonight isn't the night for this one. There will always be another room waiting here when you're ready. If you choose to stick around, however, and you enjoy what we do here, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the content. It helps keep the neon sign lit. The desk clerk told you there was no room 404 here at the Dreamland Motel. Yet here it is, a narrow hallway, a door half open, a low whir from inside. On the bedside table, a tape machine already turning. The label reads MKUltra. You press play. If the mind can be opened, it can be rewritten. Welcome to room 404. The record says it doesn't exist, but the key worked anyway. Numerous whistleblowers in ufology have testified to being subjected to elaborate mind games, experiences they believe to be the modern echo of techniques first conceived under the CIA's MKUltra program. Some describe psychological operations so intricate they seem impossible to untangle. Others speak of social pressure, engineered paranoia, even synthetic telepathy, claims that strain belief, yet repeat with uncanny similarity across decades. Whether every account is true almost doesn't matter, because each one reminds us of something far more important, that governments, especially in times of fear, will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their perceived interests. At some point, we the people quietly became them, the subjects. But is this ufology? It's related, a worthy corridor in the motel to explore as we journey to find the truth. There are no flying saucers here, no visitors from distant stars, only men in lab coats, mirrors, and locked doors. But in its own way, this story is still about contact. Contact between human ambition and the unknown territories of the mind. A government looking inward, not upward, and finding something every bit as alien. The official record says MKUltra was a CIA behavioral modification program that ran from 1953 to 1973. That's the language of bureaucracy. It sounds almost clean, but the reality was anything but. MKUltra was one point on a long, blood-stained timeline of human experimentation, one that stretches back long before the Cold War. To understand its origins, we have to step further into the dark, not into the 1950s, but all the way into the 1940s, into the laboratories of war. The Second World War was, among many things, a war of science, and science lost its soul in the process. In the frozen barracks of Dachau, Nazi doctors stripped prisoners naked and plunged them into ice water to test the limits of human survival. They watched men shiver, seize, and finally fall silent, all in the name of hypothermia research. At Buchenwald, inmates were infected with malaria and typhus to test new drugs. At Ravensbrück, women had their bones shattered, muscles cut, and nerves severed, then treated to see how wounds might heal. And in Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele stared into the eyes of twins, children, and injected one with chemicals just to see if the other's heart would stop too. They called it research. They called it medicine. But it was only control. The oldest dream of tyrants, wearing a white coat instead of a uniform. Thousands perished in the name of progress. And when the war ended, justice, like ethics, was selective. The world tried to atone. The Nuremberg doctors' trial condemned 23 Nazi physicians, and from those horrors came the Nuremberg Code, a promise that never again would a human be experimented on without voluntary consent. But promises fade, because even as those trials took place, the United States was quietly importing Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. Men like Hubertus Strughold, who'd once overseen high-altitude experiments on prisoners, were brought to America to build the space program. Others, like Kurt Blum, who'd tested plague vaccines on the dying, were spared execution in exchange for their knowledge of biological weapons. And somewhere in Washington, someone decided that the data gathered in Dachau and Auschwitz, even data born of agony, might still be useful. A US military report recommended adopting Sigmund Rascher's freezing research for pilot survival training. A captured dossier on mescaline, used by Nazi doctors as a truth serum, inspired the US Navy's first post-war interrogation drug program, Project Chatter. The line between condemnation and imitation was already dissolved. Across the Pacific, another empire had written its own chapter in the anatomy of cruelty. In the fields of Manchuria, behind high walls and frozen air, stood Unit 731, a Japanese biological warfare division commanded by General Shiro Ishii. Here, the scientists called their victims Maruta. Logs. Men, women and children infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Limbs frozen solid in winter wind, then struck with sticks to study the fracture of flesh. Prisoners strapped to stakes while germ bombs exploded around them. Infants vivisected without anesthesia, their organs studied as they died. Over 3,000 perished inside the compound. Outside, in surrounding Chinese villages, an estimated 200,000 more died as Unit 731 unleashed plague fleas and pathogens on civilians. When the war ended, the Americans found the ruins and a decision to make: prosecute or profit. General Douglas MacArthur chose profit. In 1947, he struck a deal: immunity for data. Unit 731 scientists were spared trial in exchange for their reports on biological warfare, frostbite resistance, germ dispersal, tissue decay. The files were shipped to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the heart of America's bioweapons program. The data was stamped top secret and buried in archives, while General Ishii retired peacefully in Japan. The US gained knowledge, the world lost its moral footing, and the message was clear: if atrocities could yield results, atrocities could be forgiven. In the years that followed, the United States would conduct thousands of experiments of its own. The targets weren't enemy soldiers, they were ordinary Americans. In hospitals, scientists injected unwitting patients with plutonium to track its movement through the body. In prisons, men were exposed to radiation and nerve agents to see what levels could be survived. At the Fernald School, children with developmental disabilities were fed oatmeal laced with radioactive iron, told it would help their teeth. At Willowbrook, disabled children were deliberately infected with hepatitis to study immunity. At Holmesburg Prison, inmates were coated in dioxin and psychoactive drugs, while corporations and military researchers took notes. Some were paid a few dollars, most were told nothing. None were truly given a chance. By the mid-1950s, the United States, the nation that had drafted the Nuremberg Code, was running experiments on its own citizens that broke every rule the code had set. This is the world that birthed MKUltra, a world where the language of defense had become indistinguishable from the language of violation. After the war, the fear shifted, not of bombs, but of influence. Reports from Korea spoke of American prisoners of war returning brainwashed, reciting enemy propaganda. Rumors claimed the Soviets and Chinese were developing drugs, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning to bend prisoners' wills. And so, once again, the US government looked into the mirror and decided to become what it had feared. In 1950, the CIA launched Project Bluebird, soon renamed Artichoke, and finally MKUltra. Its purpose was simple and monstrous: to learn how to control a human mind. A memo from the time stated the goal plainly: to create a condition in which the subject will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature. That sentence could have been written in Dachau, or Harbin, or Washington. Because MKUltra didn't appear from nowhere, it was the logical next step. The moment all those scattered lines of human experimentation finally converged into one program. From Nazi freezing tanks to Japanese vivisection tables, from American hospitals to CIA safe houses, the spirit was the same. curiosity without conscience, ambition without empathy, progress without permission. The record calls MKUltra a program, but that word feels too small. It wasn't a single project, or even a single idea. It was the continuation of a pattern, the old nightmare that science could exist without morality, reborn under new management. It was the belief that the human mind was just another landscape to be conquered, another continent on the map of empire. It was never one project. It was a mindset. And like all mindsets born of fear, it spread. End of file. Proceed to next segment. But before you do, you take a moment to breathe, because the line between experimenter and subject is thinner than it seems, and tonight you're standing right on it. Fear is a careful teacher. In the early 1950s, the United States learned a new vocabulary for it: defection, indoctrination, brainwashing. American prisoners of war came home from Korea and, on camera, recited enemy talking points with flat voices and faraway eyes. A few refused repatriation. Newspapers whispered a new phrase: the Manchurian Candidate. And the public imagination did the rest. If a soldier could be bent, perhaps anyone could. And if the enemy knew how to do it, then not knowing was a liability the size of a superpower. That's the first reason they needed control: defense. The second reason was the same as it's always been: ambition. The men who greenlit these programs didn't carry themselves like villains. They wore the posture of problem solvers. In a world that had just split the atom and stitched radar into the skin of the sky, the mind looked like the final frontier of national security. One more system to model, disrupt, and reprogram. Inside the CIA, the logic was formalized in memos with tidy margins. Could drugs or hypnosis push a person beyond self-preservation? Could fear, isolation, or sensory flood erase a personality and install another? Could a prisoner be made to talk? Could an agent be made to forget? The words were clinical. The target was intimate. To expand on what we previously mentioned, they called the first pass Bluebird in 1950. Learn what the Soviets are doing. Test our own inoculations against coercion. Within a year, Bluebird molted into Artichoke, a colder name for a colder mandate. Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, even against fundamental laws of nature and all instincts for self-preservation? The sentence reads like a dare to the species. By 1953, with Alan Dulles at the helm, the questions became a budget line: MKUltra. Dulles had given a speech not long before about a battle for men's minds. It sounded like a metaphor. Inside the building, it wasn't. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, watching the Soviets and the technical services staff building tools, aligned around a simple premise: If there was even a 10% chance our adversaries could puppet a mind, we had to close that gap first, and if possible, reverse it. And behind the desks sat a chemist who believed chemistry could open the lock. Sidney Gottlieb. He didn't think of LSD as a party drug. He thought of it as a key. If reality was a door, perhaps a drop on the tongue could loosen the hinges. Defense on paper, offense in practice. The defensive story they told Congress and themselves went like this. We must inoculate our officers against interrogation techniques. We must teach agents to resist drugs, hypnosis, sleep deprivation. We must develop truth serums only so we know how to defeat them. But underneath, the defense was the ancient itch of power. If we can inoculate, we can induce. If we can protect our minds, we can enter theirs. If we can keep a secret safe, we can steal one. If we can stop a confession, we can script one. The requirement document reflects both faces at once. Counter-brainwashing manuals drafted alongside interrogation protocols. Research on amnesia adjacent to ideas about programming couriers who wouldn't remember their packages. This is how bureaucracies moralize the extraordinary. Write 2 use cases, fund the bolder one. There was another current moving under the floorboards. Paperclip. Not the men themselves. The Chapter 1 roll call is behind us, but the inheritance of possibility. When you bring in people who treated biology like clay, you import a worldview. That constraints are negotiable if the objective is grand enough. You don't have to mention Germany or Manchuria in a memo. You just write, time is of the essence. And everyone understands that ethics are elastic when the enemy is existential. Psychology was changing too. Behaviorists were mapping conditioning with the confidence of cartographers. Stimulus response, reinforcement schedules, de-patterning and re-patterning, whispered in clinical journals. In that climate, the soul looked like an old superstition. Consciousness, a stack of levers and lights waiting for the right hands. When you believe that, the leap from theory to human trials is smaller than a sigh. And then there was the zeitgeist, the air that everyone breathed without noticing. Radio beamed across continents. Television set the cadence of living rooms. Advertising agencies boasted they could engineer desire with colour palettes and placement. The science of persuasion left the lecture hall and learned to buy billboards. If you can sell a cigarette to a nation, perhaps you can sell a memory to a single mind, or erase one. It wasn't just spies who pursued control. It was modernity itself. MKUltra was where those currents met. Fear of enemy sorcery, faith in human engineering, and the dawning recognition that attention is a resource that can be mined. Inside the building, the questions got more specific. What is the dose-response curve of LSD in unsuspecting subjects? Can hypnosis partition identity into compartments with separate passwords? Does sensory deprivation soften the mind's surface, make new impressions stick? Can electroshock erase a pattern of thought so thoroughly that a new one can be written? Is there a sweet spot where fear and isolation produce maximal compliance without collapse? Outside the building, the justification stayed simple. They're doing it. We must too. When you repeat that long enough, it becomes a lullaby for the conscience. The money moved through foundations with warm names. The studies ran in universities with proud seals. Fronts were established so that a professor could sign a contract without seeing Langley's watermark. And if a hospital director asked too many questions, the funding went elsewhere. Curiosity is a market, and it will find sellers. But the deepest reason, the one no memo will say aloud, is this. To outthink the enemy, they first had to outthink humanity. Not the species' brilliance, its boundaries. If the self is a perimeter, where does it give? How much sleep can you take away before the gate opens? How much noise before the guard stops listening? How much loneliness before the prisoner builds a friend out of the interrogator's voice? These are not tactical questions. They are metaphysical ones, disguised as fieldcraft. The answers would not only help in a basement room with a single bulb, they would ripple outward into training manuals, foreign prisons, and eventually into quieter technologies, algorithms that learn you faster than you learn yourself. MKUltra did not invent those questions, but it formalized them. It gave them an office number and a burn bag. There's another why worth gently saying. Institutions don't chase the enemy, they chase momentum. A program justified to stop a hypothetical Soviet serum becomes a line item, then a department, then a mandate to innovate, lest the budget be cut. Curiosity becomes a performance metric. Good people tell themselves they're just mapping the edges so others won't fall off. So why do they need to control minds? Because fear made it reasonable. Because science made it plausible. Because bureaucracy made it durable. Because ambition made it irresistible. And because, in a century that learned how to split the atom and compute the weather, it began to seem inefficient that a human being could still say no. We told ourselves it was to protect the free world. We did not notice what we were doing to the free. This isn't a story about what the enemy did. It's a story about what fear taught us we were allowed to try ourselves. And that is why, when you open the next tape and hear the list of methods, drugs, hypnosis, isolation, electricity, you will understand that the tools were never the point. The premise was. Tested under various conditions, including prolonged exposure, isolation, and hypnotic suggestion. Further data to follow. Click. Silence, then another voice, calm and professional. We were trying to dissolve the self and see what was left. The previous chapter was about the why. This one is about the how far they went, how they tested their theories, how the pursuit of control slipped its leash and became something else entirely. They began with the simplest of catalysts, chemistry. In the early 1950s, the CIA had its hands on a new compound, a Swiss pharmaceutical curiosity that could rearrange perception itself. LSD-25. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist at the heart of MKUltra, saw it not as a drug, but as a doorway. If you could open the mind that easily, he wondered, maybe you could walk inside. Soon, hundreds of subjects were enlisted. Some volunteered. Most didn't know they had. In hospitals, prisoners, mental patients, and servicemen were dosed without warning. At the Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell used addicts as his subjects, men desperate enough to trade their bodies for morphine. They were told it was research into addiction. In reality, they were given LSD every day for 77 consecutive days, watched like specimens as their grip on reality melted away. Elsewhere, the CIA brought its experiments out of the lab and into the streets. It was called Operation Midnight Climax, a phrase that sounded like a bad pulp novel. But the truth was stranger. In San Francisco and New York, CIA frontmen rented apartments and outfitted them with microphones, cameras, and one-way mirrors. They hired sex workers to lure clients to these safe houses. Drinks were spiked, curtains drawn. The men never knew they'd been drugged. On the other side of the glass, CIA officers sat with notepads and whiskey, watching what LSD did to a human being when pleasure turned to panic. The reports are clinical, but you can read the voyeurism between the lines. They weren't just studying the drug, they were studying power, how it feels to hold it, unseen. When Gottlieb learned that an army scientist named Frank Olson had grown disturbed by what he'd seen inside the program, he decided to test the loyalty of his own men. One night at a retreat, he slipped LSD into their drinks without warning. Olson spiraled into paranoia and despair, convinced he had seen too much. 9 days later, he fell from a hotel window in New York. Officially, he'd done it to himself. Unofficially, it was the moment MKUltra's reflection blinked back and smiled. If LSD could dissolve the self chemically, isolation could do it mechanically. In Montreal, a mild-mannered psychologist named Donald Hebb sealed volunteers into padded cubicles, goggles on, hands gloved, sound reduced to a hum. At first, they rested. Then, they hallucinated. After 2 days, many begged to be released. They described dreamlike visions, coloured lights, phantom figures, whispered voices. When they emerged, Hebb found something extraordinary. They were suggestible. Tell them a ghost story in that state, and they would believe it. Ask them to question their memories, and they would. Hebb stopped his work, calling it torture, but by then, the CIA had noticed. His findings flowed straight into MKUltra's next experiments, where isolation became a tool, not a warning. Prisoners and psychiatric patients were confined in soundproof rooms for days, with only a light bulb for company. The air conditioning hissed white noise until thoughts started to fray. When the mind runs out of input, out of food for thought, it begins to eat itself. In one recorded session, a subject sobbed as he said he could hear his own heartbeat, like a drum inside the walls. Another began speaking to the mirror as if it were answering. When interrogators entered, the subjects clung to them like saviours. They'd become dependent, and therefore open. This was the scientific rebranding of psychological torture. Not broken bones, broken boundaries. By 1963, the method had been codified in an official CIA document called the Q-Bark Manual, which calmly outlined how to soften resistance through sleep deprivation, isolation, and sensory control. The same logic that began in a Montreal lab would one day echo through military prisons on other continents, in other wars. While Gottlieb's chemists played with molecules, another man believed he could reformat the human mind electrically. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a respected psychiatrist, head of the World Psychiatric Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute. His idea was elegant in theory. Wipe the mind clean, then rebuild it better. He called it depatterning. In practice, it meant extreme electroshock therapy, far beyond accepted medical doses. Patients suffering mild depression or anxiety were strapped down and blasted with multiple high-voltage shocks daily, often for weeks. Between sessions, they were sedated into drug-induced comas, sometimes for months, their dreams invaded by looped messages played through speakers near their beds. You are a good mother. You are calm. You will not be afraid. Over and over, thousands of repetitions. The recordings were called psychic driving. To Cameron, it was science. To the patients, it was obliteration. When they woke, they were infantile, unable to speak, remember their names, or recognize their families. Some had to relearn how to eat and walk. Others never recovered at all. The CIA funded it as Subproject 68, eager to see whether total personality erasure was possible. Cameron sent reports back through his channels. Gottlieb read them with fascination. If LSD could dissolve the mind temporarily, Cameron's techniques appeared to erase it completely. The subjects, housewives, veterans, young mothers, became unwitting experiments in the destruction of identity. Years later, when survivors sued, both the Canadian and the US governments quietly settled. But their memories, fragmented, dreamlike, half erased, tell the story better than any file ever could. One victim said she remembered, quote, "a voice in the dark telling me I was nobody." She believed it. As MKUltra expanded, curiosity turned mystical. If drugs and electricity could reach the mind, could thought alone do the same? In Subproject 136, the CIA funded research into ESP and telepathy. They wanted to know whether ideas could be sent from one brain to another, or whether dreams could be influenced from afar. Scientists tested psychic senders in controlled rooms, trying to transmit shapes or colours to remote viewers under hypnosis. Sometimes they scored above chance, enough to keep the funding alive, never enough to prove anything. The agency's own summary was pragmatic, interesting but unreliable. Still, fragments of this research survived into later programs like Project Stargate, where remote viewers tried to visualize secret Soviet bases from halfway across the world. The CIA's interest wasn't belief, it was contingency. If consciousness had even a 1% chance of being a battlefield, they wanted to claim it first. And then there were the dream experiments. A few MKUltra sub-projects explored whether subliminal messages played during sleep could implant ideas. Subjects, often psychiatric patients, were sedated and played loops of phrases through pillow speakers. When they awoke, researchers asked leading questions to see if the suggestions had taken root. Results, however, were inconsistent, but the implication lingered. Maybe the mind could be rewritten in its most defenseless state. Some accounts suggest they even tried pairing dream manipulation with LSD and hypnosis, chasing the idea of creating programmable states of consciousness. One CIA memo described it as an attempt to utilize the unconscious for directed purpose. Even the language reads like incantation. Who were the subjects? They were prisoners, promised leniency for participation. They were psychiatric patients, told it was therapy. They were soldiers, ordered to volunteer. They were civilians, lured by advertisements for paid research studies at universities and hospitals. At the New York Psychiatric Institute, one student took part in an experiment on dreams. He was unknowingly dosed with LSD, spent 10 days in a psych ward, and never fully recovered. At the Edgewood Arsenal, soldiers tested nerve agents and hallucinogens under the banner of patriotism. At Lexington, addicts traded their sanity for morphine rations. In San Francisco, unsuspecting men stumbled home through the fog, the night warped beyond comprehension. They called these places laboratories, but they were mirrors, each experiment reflecting a belief that human beings were problems to be solved, their minds clay to be reshaped in secret. We were looking for control. What we found was the abyss. The official files are clinical. Doses, durations, voltage, recovery times. What they don't record is what it felt like. To wake up and not know your name. To be told your memories were experiments. To realize you'd been a project. Sidney Gottlieb wasn't a cartoon villain. He meditated, raised goats, practiced environmentalism, and saw himself as a patriot. He believed he was defending democracy by dismantling the mind in the lab. He called LSD a tool for expanding consciousness, and yet used it to erase. He wanted to dissolve the self, and he did. What was left was the wreckage of identity itself, and a government that had proven the ultimate point of control wasn't in weapons or walls, but in perception. These aren't facts. They're shadows, and sometimes the shadows line up too neatly to ignore. The thing about a secret program is it doesn't really end. It diffuses. It drifts into other rooms, other people, other headlines. And sometimes when history blinks, you can almost see its reflection. So let's walk softly now. This part is speculation. Think of it as the static between channels. Sometimes the static says more than the signal. Lee Harvey Oswald, the quiet Marine who learned Russian before most kids could drive. He worked radar at Atsugi, the same Japanese base that tested U-2 spy planes and housed CIA contractors running early behavior studies. Then he defected to the Soviet Union. Then he came back, with no charges, no trial, and a passport renewed in record time. Officially, he was just a confused man. Unofficially, people wondered what kind of confusion gets you that kind of leniency. Immediately after his arrest for the assassination of JFK, he claimed he was a patsy, blamed for a crime he didn't commit. Or perhaps didn't remember committing. Charles Manson. He'd spent half his life in institutions before anyone called him a prophet. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, where he and his followers drifted through, happened to be collecting data for federally funded LSD trials under Dr. David Smith, the kind of research the CIA liked to keep its eyes on. Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, was tied to that same clinic, studying how LSD affected behavior and group bonding. Manson was arrested again and again, weapons, drugs, parole violations, and somehow he kept getting released. When the blood dried at Cielo Drive, people started looking backward. Maybe he wasn't controlled. Maybe he just learned what control looked like, up close. When he said, "I am what you made me," it didn't sound like poetry anymore. Sirhan. He practiced at the firing range. He wrote in loops, "RFK must die, RFK must die," page after page. And when the moment came, he said he remembered nothing. Even now, after half a century, he says his memory stops at the sound of a woman's voice counting backwards. His lawyers claimed hypnosis. They even found a psychiatrist who said he could still be under. There were whispers that someone, somewhere, had tried to demonstrate just how effective post-hypnotic suggestion could be. Was Sirhan a trigger or a warning? Maybe both. Perhaps the perfect example of what the program was always trying to make. A man whose will could be edited like a paragraph. James Whitey Bulger. This one's not rumour, it's confession. In 1957, at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Whitey volunteered for what he thought were medical experiments. They called it MKUltra Subproject 44. He was dosed with LSD every day for over a year, part of a study on hallucinogenic reactions in criminals. He later said he was told it was a cure for schizophrenia. Ted Kaczynski. At Harvard, 16 years old, quiet, brilliant. He joined a psychological study ran by Henry Murray, a man who'd helped design wartime interrogation methods. For 3 years, Murray's students were humiliated, insulted, told their beliefs were worthless, all while hooked to electrodes measuring stress responses. Kaczynski later vanished into the woods and started sending bombs to the architects of the technological world he despised. He became the Unabomber. No paper ever says MKUltra funded Murray, but the overlap, timing, methodology, intention hums like feedback. Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley Jr. One shot Lennon, the other Ronald Reagan. Both heard voices, both fixated on fame and fantasy. Both rewrote history in a single gunshot. Each had been under psychiatric care that involved experimental medications and suggestibility testing. In another era, that might have been a coincidence, but in the MKUltra era, coincidence always sounds like design. Some names never made the papers. Students at McGill, prisoners in Kentucky, soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal. Men and women who woke up years later with fragments they couldn't explain, gaps that smelled of antiseptic and fear. When Director Helms ordered the records destroyed, it wasn't the evidence that vanished, it was the people. The ones who slipped through the cracks, ordinary lives that never felt ordinary again. Maybe none of them were part of it, or maybe all of them were. Just different rooms in the same motel. What's left behind isn't proof, only a pattern. Men who forgot what they'd done. Women who remembered what couldn't have happened. And a government that insisted it had stopped asking those kinds of questions. When you erase the record, you erase the evidence, but not the consequence. In the spring of 1973, the CIA decided to burn its ghosts. Director Richard Helms, a man known for his calm, surgical manner, issued an order to destroy every MKUltra file in existence. Helms was retiring. So was Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who had dosed hundreds without consent in his quest to dissolve the human will. Together, they decided that what had been done for the good of the nation should not survive to trouble it. Boxes upon boxes of reports, memos, receipts, case files, thousands of pages, were fed into furnaces. Gottlieb later said he believed it was a good idea. Helms would tell Congress that he simply wanted to protect the identity of people who had assisted the CIA. But buried in that polite language was something else, an understanding that what they had built was indefensible. One CIA assistant objected, saying the agency had spent millions of dollars on this research, and that if it were ever needed again, there would be nothing left to guide them. Helms ignored him. The flames rose anyway. They thought they were erasing a program. What they actually erased was the proof of how far it went. 4 years later, in a warehouse mislabeled as financial archives, a young archivist found 7 boxes the fire had missed. Inside, budgets, payment memos, contract notes, the paperwork trail of what had been a 149 sub-project empire. They listed 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and 185 researchers, most hidden behind initials. The scientists had been working through cut-out foundations, unaware that the money came from the CIA. They thought they were studying learning, hypnosis, or addiction. In truth, they were helping an agency map the edges of the human mind. Those boxes became the skeleton key. The ghosts, it turned out, hadn't all been burned, just misplaced. When the New York Times printed Seymour Hersh's expose on CIA domestic abuses, the country looked up from its coffee and realized the nightmares were real. President Ford launched the Rockefeller Commission. Congress opened the Church Committee. And the public learned that the CIA had run secret drug experiments on unwitting Americans for 20 years. At every level of society, from soldier to addicts, from psychiatric patients to bystanders in motel rooms. one report spoke bluntly. These experiments were clearly illegal. The commission confirmed that one man had already died, the aforementioned Dr. Frank Olson, who plunged from the hotel window after being dosed with LSD by his colleagues. The Inspector General's report, long buried, declared that by 1963 the agency had finally recognized serious moral and legal issues and ordered an end to unwitting drugging, but the paper trail suggested the work simply changed names. In the Senate hearings, officials described things that sounded less like science and more like nightmares. Operation Midnight Climax, where CIA paid prostitutes slipped LSD into drinks while agents watched from behind the one-way mirror. Dr. Ewan Cameron and his psychic driving, in which patients were kept in drug-induced comas and blasted with recorded messages until their personalities disintegrated. And a program that had used children and prisoners in sensory isolation tests designed to make them forget who they were. This is not science, one senator said. This is sorcery with a government budget. The hearings left the public stunned. Americans who had grown up believing their government to be the moral counterweight to totalitarianism now had to face that it had borrowed the same playbook, that it had pursued mind control with the same zeal that others had once pursued genocide. Helms was gone. Gottlieb had vanished to India. No one was punished. But something in the American psyche cracked that summer. The spell of innocence broke. Helms told Congress the work had ended years earlier. He wasn't lying. Not exactly. He was just using past tense for a program that had changed its name. After MKUltra came MK Search, a continuation designed to develop a capability to manipulate human behavior in a predictable manner through the use of drugs. It was the same work under a new banner, running quietly from 1965 until, ironically, the same year Helms ordered the bonfire, in 1973. Within MK Search lived its own sub-projects. MK Chickwit, which scouted foreign pharmaceuticals for new hallucinogens and behavioural agents, and MK Often, which tested the effects of those substances on soldiers, prisoners, and animals. Officially, MK Often focused on toxicology and behaviour. Unofficially, and this part comes to us as rumour, it may have wandered into stranger terrain. Psychics, mediums, occultists, even practitioners of voodoo. There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of CIA officers visiting astrologers, of attempts to summon entities, not for belief, but for data. No document ever proved this, but given what the program had already done in daylight, the shadows don't seem so far-fetched. By the early 1970s, the military had caught the fever too. At Stanford Research Institute, physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ began testing people who claimed to see at a distance. Their early subjects, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, described hidden Soviet bases, downed bombers, even the rings of Jupiter, years before NASA confirmed them. The Pentagon called it remote viewing. The CIA called it Project Stargate. For 20 years they tried to train psychic spies. Some sessions seemed uncanny. Others were nonsense. By 1995, after 2 decades of inconclusive data, the CIA pulled the plug. Officially, Stargate was terminated. Unofficially, Some say it simply moved off the books. When the Rockefeller and Church reports were finally published, the findings were grim, but the remedies were earnest. Ford issued an executive order forbidding any future drug experiments on unwitting subjects. Congress built permanent intelligence oversight committees. The CIA promised reform, and Director Stansfield Turner swore under oath that the agency is in no way engaged in either witting or unwitting testing of drugs today. The nation believed him, or wanted to. Yet in those same hearings, senators learned that 44 universities, 12 hospitals, 3 prisons, and at least 15 private companies had all played host to MKUltra work. Some institutions only found out when the subpoenas arrived. Their professors had been publishing papers, their data funded by the agency, without their knowledge. What the hearings couldn't answer was the question that still lingers. When you burn the evidence, how do you truly measure the damage? How many lives were altered, erased, or rewritten under the label of national security? How many patients lay in hospital beds, told they were participating in harmless studies, never knowing their dreams were being mapped for control? The CIA couldn't say. The files were gone. The victims, many still alive, never got their names back. In the years that followed, MKUltra became a myth, a warning, a code word whispered whenever someone mentioned behavioral research or psychological warfare. But the truth is, it didn't end. It simply changed interface. When the CIA's old manuals were declassified, the QBARC interrogation guide came to light. The Human Resource Exploitation Manual. Investigators saw the fingerprints, sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, induced fear, the same principles of mind control, stripped of LSD and dressed in psychology. They appeared again in black sites and war zones decades later, under new euphemisms, enhanced techniques, stretch positions, no-touch torture. And outside the agency, beyond the walls of government, another kind of MKUltra had begun. No drugs, no electrodes, just algorithms. Millions now volunteer their data, their habits, their attention spans, fed into invisible systems that learn how to predict, persuade, and shape them. The methods are cleaner, but the idea is the same. Alter behavior without consent. Researchers once used LSD to dissolve the self. Now code does it, softly, persistently, invisibly. What once required a safe house and a syringe now happens through a feed, a phone, a like, a loop. Officially closed, unofficially rebranded. You can burn the files, but you can't burn what's already in the bloodstream. So, did MKUltra really end? That depends on how you define the program itself. In my opinion, yes, the experimentation on unsuspecting innocent citizens probably stopped, at least for the most part. But do I think it ended because those in charge realized the error of their ways? Because some collective conscience suddenly awoke inside the agency? No. It ended because they'd accomplished their goal. By then, the damage had been done. No more need to research, no more need to test. And historically, What happens after we test? After we iterate the versions, refine the methods, correct the flaws? What comes next? Deployment. These techniques were developed for a reason. Do you think the government spent millions doing the most abhorrent things imaginable to their own citizens, making what they would call the moral sacrifice in service of their country, only to lock it all away forever? Of course not. You don't end a program like that because it failed. You end because it worked. And so, we play that part of the tape again. When you erase the record, you erase the evidence, but not the consequence. They say MKUltra ended in 1973, but every few years, someone comes along with a story that makes you wonder. Stories that don't come from the 1950s or the Cold War, but from right now, from our own time. Stories that sound like modern echoes of an experiment we were told had been buried and burned. What follows isn't a claim that MKUltra survived, but that its fingerprints may still be pressed into the walls of certain rooms, places where secrecy meets trauma, and where truth is treated like a contagion. We start in the forest, Rendlesham, 1980. A base, a flash of light, a handful of men stepping into something history still can't explain. But this part of the story isn't about what they saw. For that, you can watch my full episode on the Rendlesham Forest incident, Part 1. Part 2, coming later this year. Tonight, it's about what those men were made to forget. Decades after the incident, Colonel Charles Holt, the man who led the second night investigation, told researchers something that still makes my stomach twist. After the incident, 4 of his men were taken away by Air Force investigators. They were debriefed, they were questioned, and they were injected with something. He said hypnosis was used, and drugs too. Sodium pentothal. And when those men returned, they remembered strange things. Binary codes, messages from beyond. Their stories no longer fit together, each man remembering things differently, remembering details that Holt himself never witnessed. He came to believe those memories weren't theirs at all, that the purpose of those sessions wasn't just to learn what happened, but to rewrite it. It sounds impossible, and yet the words feel familiar, don't they? Like a page torn from the MKUltra manual itself. Drugs, hypnosis, confusion, control. Sometimes I wonder if the truth of Rendlesham isn't about what came from the sky, but what was done after it landed. Then there's Bob Lazar. This is a small detail, but I still find it intriguing after all these years. The story's been told 1,000 times, and of course, you can watch my full episode on Bob Lazar's entire story. 9 propulsion systems, Element 115, the facility called S4. But there's one detail that always stuck with me. When Lazar was briefed, he says he was given a drink, a green liquid. He laughed it off at the time, and is unable to provide much more context than this. But what if it wasn't a joke? What if that ritual, that cup, was symbolic of something the government had already learned how to do? A chemical that blurs the edges of memory, a gesture of ownership, a warning. We can take back what we give you. There's no proof, of course, just Lazar's memory of the glass in his hand, but it fits the pattern. After MKUltra was exposed in the 70s, you'd think the world would never believe another mind control story again. And yet they kept coming. Candy Jones, America's wartime pin-up-turned radio host, claimed under hypnosis that she'd lived a double life, that another personality had been created inside her, trained by CIA doctors to carry secret messages she would never consciously remember. She even found a passport for the other woman, Arlene. Whether it was trauma, suggestion, or something darker, her story was published just 1 year before MKUltra was officially confirmed. It's easy to dismiss until you realize she described the method: hypnosis, drugs, identity splitting, with eerie accuracy. Then there was Kathy O'Brien, 2 decades later, claiming she'd been raised in a government breeding ground for disassociative slaves, what she called Project Monarch. She said she'd been used by politicians, by celebrities, her consciousness fractured into controllable fragments through trauma and ritual. Her story was wild. Too wild for even most conspiracy theorists. But her words took root. Online forums filled with people who saw monarch symbols everywhere. Butterflies in music videos, dolls in pop culture, a language of control hidden in plain sight. It's almost poetic. A program that once thrived in secrecy now survives as an idea, endlessly mirrored back through culture. Whether monarch ever existed hardly matters. What matters is that millions believe it could, and that belief itself is a kind of control. Then came the military abductions, what we call in ufology my labs. People who said their alien abductors weren't alien at all, that the hands holding the needles were human, that the soldiers standing over them wore insignias, not stars. In these accounts, the military uses hypnosis, drugs, even holograms to simulate ET encounters. A perfect cover for experiments in trauma and compliance. If MKUltra was a scalpel, my labs are the scalpel wearing a mask. Some of these witnesses are sincere, trembling, crying, describing fluorescent rooms, bright lights, and human voices saying, "Forget." It could be delusion, it could be disinformation, or it could be the ultimate evolution of the same experiment. Psychological warfare turned inward. And so the culmination of tonight's episode brings us to October 2025. At the time of this recording, I'm still personally processing the events of the past month. As many of you know, in early September, I travelled to Washington for the UAP hearings, where we heard from 4 men who have experienced incredible things. One of those men, his testimony shook me to my core. I watched him tremble as he spoke. I heard the quiver in his voice echo against the marble walls. He arrived, told his story, and left. A man both terrified and determined. His name is Dylan Borland. He served as a geospatial intelligence specialist in the US Air Force from 2010 to 2013, trained to read the hidden patterns of the world, radar, video, light and shadow. After leaving active duty, he continued his work with BAE Systems and Intrepid Solutions, analysing the skies with a precision few possess. In time, he stepped forward as a federal whistleblower, testifying to both the Intelligence Community Inspector General and the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. His claim was simple and extraordinary, that he had seen craft and had been exposed to technologies not of our own making, operating beyond oversight and beyond explanation. I thought his story would stop at technology, the craft, retrievals, things that defy our physics. But I learned that wasn't the part that haunted him most. What haunted him was what happened after. After he came forward, after he told the truth, after he became a problem. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Dylan appeared on Jeremy Corbell's Weaponized podcast, and what he shared there still lingers with me. Because it wasn't a story about UFOs, it was a story about what can happen when you try to speak. He'd first come under the VA's care after witnessing a traumatic event during his service, an image that, even years later, he said still played behind his eyes when he tried to sleep. That's what led him to seek help in the first place. But instead of healing, he says what followed felt like punishment. He was labelled delusional in his VA records, accused of falsifying police reports, branded a liar by the very system meant to help him. He says his identity was rewritten on paper first, then in practice. They took his clearance, they removed his ability to get a job, and slowly they began to take his sense of reality. He describes being placed into a hypnosis biofeedback program. Each week he was wired to sensors, told to count backwards from 100 by sevens, while a screen flashed images in front of him. An Afghan child holding a rifle, then curiously a butterfly, then a face, and maybe a flash of light. If he stumbled on a number, the room erupted, shouting, an air horn, the command to start again. It sounds absurd until you remember where you've heard it before. Flash imagery, stress induction, repetition, all an eerie amalgamation of techniques explored by Donald Hebb, Ewan Cameron, and Henry Murray. A Clockwork Orange, rewritten for the VA. He said he lost everything but his house, that at one point he was considering minor crimes just to land himself a cell and 3 meals a day. That's not hyperbole. That's how far they pushed him. He was prescribed antidepressants and PTSD meds, though the VA simultaneously denied he had PTSD or depression. And one night, he says he woke up with an impulse so foreign it terrified him. Not a thought, not an emotion, a physical command. He describes it like thirst, like you need to relieve yourself. A voice written into muscle memory that was begging him to end his own life. He'd never had those thoughts before. Being religious, it's against his faith. But that night, he says it was like someone had reached into his head and flipped a switch he didn't know existed. He went straight to the VA, panicked and desperate, and was told by a psychiatrist, who he later learned had CIA ties, that his experience was common and that he should increase the dosage. That's when another doctor stepped in, a man who, according to Dylan, read his file and realized something was wrong. He filed a complaint with the Inspector General, saying Dylan was being deliberately targeted. He told Dylan, quietly, "You need to do everything in your power to live through this. What they're doing to you is wrong. Don't trust any of these doctors." And then he resigned, walked away in protest. The only person who believed him, gone overnight. Mind warfare developed by Donald Hebb, Ewan Cameron, and Henry Murray. And now, the techniques developed by the head of MKUltra himself, Sidney Gottlieb. It's a full house. You can feel it in his voice when he talks about this. That same terror I heard in person in Washington. It wasn't fear of aliens or even the government. It was the fear of losing yourself, piece by piece, memory by memory, until you can't tell where the lies stop and you begin. Dylan Borland's story may so far be impossible to verify, but it feels like an echo. The same melody we've heard before, back when men in lab coats tried to play God with consciousness. They called it MKUltra then. Maybe now it goes by a different name. Either way, the machinery still hums, and sometimes the gears catch a man like Dylan and grind his sanity into proof of its own success. People may argue that Dylan Borland's very survival of this ordeal is proof itself that MKUltra clearly didn't work. But I must remind you, history is written by the victors. It's all too scarily possible that this seems such a rare occurrence, because the truth is, normally, these tactics work. We've heard of more modern accounts of people being driven over the edge psychologically. I won't go into them specifically. But it's safe to say, yes, Dylan survived. But how many haven't? We know some of what they did. We know some of who they hurt. But the rest is smoke. When the CIA destroyed the MKUltra archives in 1973, they didn't just burn evidence. They burned context. They left holes behind, gaps in the timeline, gaps in accountability. Of the 149 sub-projects, many are still nothing more than a project code and a dollar amount. Some files read like crossword puzzles made of redacted bars. Others, gone entirely. Historians find fragments, chemical receipts without purpose, budget memos for psychophysiological interface, experiment logs missing every name but the accountant's. And every time someone thinks they've found the full picture, another classified reference appears in the footnote. Subproject 136, 94, 119. The ghosts of programs nested inside each other, their meanings dissolved by design. Maybe the scariest part isn't what they did, but what they might have done, and how much of it we'll never recover. There's a reason even the most rational historians sound superstitious when they talk about MKUltra. The absence itself feels sentient, as if the act of erasure became the final experiment. It's the blank spaces that speak the loudest. Sometimes I think that's the real legacy. An unfinished puzzle the human mind can't stop trying to solve. MKUltra was supposed to be about them. The enemy, the defectors, the spies. But, like all great obsessions, the mirror eventually turned. Every empire that seeks to control the mind of others ends up experimenting on its own reflection. Once you believe control is the same thing as safety, you stop seeing people as people. You see them as variables, as input. It starts with chemicals, then it becomes conditioning. Then, eventually, it's algorithms. The dream of MKUltra didn't die with the men who ran it. It just changed its syntax. Where they once used LSD to dissolve the ego, we now use data to reshape identity. Where they used electrodes to break resistance, we use feedback loops, notifications, the slow drip of dopamine that keeps us docile and online. And it's hard not to notice, as social media has risen, public mental health has fallen. Maybe the experiment never stopped. Maybe it just got prettier. It's not coercion anymore. It's participation. Voluntary compliance disguised as convenience. We learned that people don't need to be tortured to surrender their autonomy. They'll do it willingly, if it feels like choice. That's the moral of MKUltra, and maybe the moral of us. The tools evolve, the aim doesn't. And the scariest question of all isn't what they did, but what we've become because of it. Maybe that's what all of this has been. The longest running human trial in history. A study of obedience, conducted by ourselves, on ourselves. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm not even sure I've figured out how to live my own. But if you're struggling, if you feel alone, it's worth remembering that comfort isn't abstract. It's a physiological response. A smile, a voice that says your name with care, the embrace of someone you love. Those things can do more in 5 seconds than 5 hours of scrolling ever could. So maybe tomorrow, just try this. Put the phone face down on the table. Cook a good meal. Go for a walk. Play with your pet for 15 minutes. Let your eyes adjust to the real light of the world. Notice your breathing. This doesn't have to be a grand transformation. Just a reminder that beneath all the data, the noise, the constant experiments of modern life, we're all still human. Thanks for being with us tonight, here at the Dreamland Motel. If what you heard stayed with you, take a moment to breathe before you sleep. The world can be strange, and sometimes so can we. But we're all in this together, trying to understand what it means to be awake, what it means to dream. Until next time, sleep well, traveller. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Friedrich Nietzsche.